So picture this. You're walking through a forest about 70,000 years ago and you bump into someone, but not quite a someone. They're shorter than you, built like a tank with a brow ridge you could rest a coffee cup on. You'd probably both freeze, stare at each other, and then very slowly back away, because that someone isn't a human like you. It's a completely different species of human. And here's the wild part, that wasn't some rare freak encounter. That was Tuesday. For most of human history, there wasn't just one kind of human walking the earth. There were several, at the same time, sharing the same planet, sometimes the same valleys, occasionally, and this is where things get spicy, the same beds. And now there's just us. One species, Homo sapiens, standing alone at the top, scrolling on phones, arguing on the internet, ordering food we don't even have to cook. So the question is, what happened to everybody else? Where did they go? Did we kill them? Did they just fade out? Did we awkwardly absorb them into our gene pool? Stick around, because the answer is messier, weirder, and honestly more uncomfortable than most textbooks let on. And by the end of this, you're going to look at your own DNA a little differently. Let's set the stage. Right now, today, there is exactly one species of human on Earth. That's so normal to us that we don't even think about it. Of course, there's just one kind of human. What else would there be? But zoom out on the timeline of our genus, Homo, and you'll see that one species is actually the exception, not the rule. For almost the entire 2.5 million year history of humans, multiple species coexisted. At one point, scientists estimate there may have been at least 6 different human species alive on Earth at the same time, roughly 100,000 years ago. 6. Not 6 total throughout history, 6 at once. Imagine a planet where, instead of just humans, you had to specify which kind of human you were talking about, the way you'd specify a breed of dog. So let's meet a few of the contestants, because honestly, they deserve introductions like reality show cast members. First up, the Neanderthals, the most famous of our extinct cousins, and also the most slandered. For decades, pop culture painted Neanderthals as dumb, grunting brutes who couldn't figure out fire. Total character assassination. In reality, Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than ours. They made tools, controlled fire, buried their dead, possibly made jewelry, and recent evidence even suggests they made art. Geometric engravings on cave walls in Spain that predate modern humans showing up in the region. They lived across Europe and parts of Asia for over 300,000 years, surviving brutal ice ages that would make most of us cry into our heated blankets. These were not cavemen stumbling around confused. These were sophisticated, cold-adapted survivors. Then you've got the Denisovans, who are basically the mystery box of human evolution. We don't even have a full skeleton of a Denisovan. What we have is a pinky bone, a few teeth, and a jawbone. That's it. That's the entire physical evidence locker. And yet, from that pinky bone, scientists extracted enough DNA to prove this was an entirely distinct group of humans, genetically different from both us and the Neanderthals. They lived in Siberia and likely across Asia. And based on genetic traces in modern populations, especially in Papua New Guinea and parts of Tibet, they were widespread. Tibetans, for example, carry a Denisovan gene variant that helps them survive at high altitude with low oxygen. So somewhere, thousands of years ago, a Denisovan was basically out here doing the genetic equivalent of handing humanity a cheat code for mountain living. Then there's Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores. These humans stood about 3.5 feet tall, likely due to island dwarfism, a phenomenon where isolated populations evolve smaller body sizes over generations because of limited resources. And get this, they were still making stone tools and possibly hunting pygmy elephants, which also evolved to be smaller on that same island. Picture that ecosystem: tiny humans, tiny elephants, a whole miniature world running parallel to the rest of humanity, completely unaware of giants like us existing elsewhere. And then, just when you think it can't get weirder, there's Homo naledi, discovered in a cave system in South Africa so deep and narrow that researchers had to recruit skinny, small-framed scientists just to squeeze through the passages to retrieve the bones. Naledi had a brain about the size of an orange. Seriously, orange-sized. And yet evidence suggests they may have deliberately placed their dead in this deep cave chamber. If that's true, that's a level of ritual behavior nobody expected from a species with such a small brain. It's the kind of discovery that makes scientists go back and rewrite the textbook chapter, then quietly admit they have no idea what they're doing. So that's the cast. Neanderthals, the tough survivors. Denisovans, the genetic ghosts. Floresiensis, the tiny islanders. Naledi, the small-brained mystery. and several others we don't have time to fully cover, like Homo erectus, who deserves enormous respect because that species survived for almost 2 million years, more than 7 times longer than we've existed so far. Let that sink in for a second. Homo erectus makes our entire species look like a new employee who hasn't even made it past the probation period. Okay, so now the real question. If there were so many of them thriving for so long in so many environments, what happened? Why is it just us now? Let's talk about the leading suspect first, because it's the one everyone wants to hear about: us. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, and at some point, scientists still argue about exactly when, but somewhere around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, we started spreading out, leaving Africa, migrating into Europe, into Asia, eventually crossing into the Americas. And everywhere we went, we ran into other human species who were already there, already established, already adapted to their environments. And within a relatively short window of time, geologically speaking, those other species disappeared. That timing is suspicious. Like, I was the last person to see them alive. Suspicious. Neanderthals vanished from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago, right around the time modern humans were expanding heavily into their territory in Europe. Coincidence? Maybe. But a lot of researchers think we played a direct role. Not necessarily through outright warfare and slaughter, though that may have happened in some places, but through something arguably more devastating: competition. Here's the theory. Homo sapiens may have had certain advantages: more complex social networks, more sophisticated long-distance trade, more advanced symbolic thinking, possibly more efficient hunting strategies, and crucially, larger group sizes. If you're a Neanderthal band of 15 people and a sapiens group of 50 rolls into your hunting territory with better coordination and a wider trade network bringing in resources from hundreds of miles away, you don't need a war to lose. You just slowly get outcompeted for food, for territory, for survival margins that were already razor thin in an Ice Age world. It's less epic battle scene and more your local family shop slowly closing because a chain store opened down the street. Brutal in a quiet, grinding way. But, and this is important, competition with us wasn't the only thing going on. These species weren't living easy lives to begin with. The climate during this era was an absolute nightmare. Constant ice age fluctuations, sudden cold snaps, shifting ecosystems. Neanderthals were dealing with environmental chaos for thousands of years before modern humans even arrived in large numbers. Some researchers argue their populations were already small and fragmented, genetically isolated in pockets across Europe, which is, frankly, a recipe for extinction even without an extra species showing up to complicate things. Small, isolated populations are incredibly vulnerable. Less genetic diversity means less resilience to disease, environmental shocks, or even just bad luck over a few generations. So you've basically got two enormous pressures hitting these other human species simultaneously. Climate chaos squeezing their populations into smaller and smaller pockets, and a clever, adaptable, fast-breeding new human species moving in and eating their lunch. Sometimes literally. It's less a single cause of extinction and more a perfect storm, like getting a parking ticket on the same day your car gets towed and it starts raining. Multiple bad things all at once, compounding. Now here's where the story takes a turn that a lot of people don't expect. Because extinction implies a clean ending, like a species just stops existing and that's it. Full stop, end of chapter. But that's not really what happened with Neanderthals and Denisovans. They didn't just disappear. In a very real sense, they're still here, in us. When modern humans expanded into Europe and Asia and ran into Neanderthals and Denisovans, they didn't only compete and clash, they also, well, mingled a lot. Genetic studies of ancient DNA have confirmed that Homo sapiens interbred with both Neanderthals and Denisovans multiple times, in multiple locations over thousands of years. And the proof is sitting in your cells right now. If your ancestry traces outside of Africa, you are likely carrying somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's not a rounding error. That's an actual, measurable chunk of your genome that traces directly back to a different species of human. And it's not just sitting there doing nothing. Some of that inherited DNA actively affects modern humans today. Certain Neanderthal gene variants have been linked to immune system responses, helping some populations fight off pathogens that the Neanderthals had already adapted to over their hundreds of thousands of years in Europe. Other variants are linked to things like skin pigmentation, hair color, and even, somewhat ironically, sleep patterns and mood. There's also research suggesting some Neanderthal-derived genes are associated with increased risk for conditions like type 2 diabetes, and even how severely some people respond to certain viral infections, which became a topic of genuine scientific interest during the COVID-19 pandemic. Researchers found specific Neanderthal-inherited gene variants that influenced how badly some individuals' bodies reacted to the virus. So somewhere in the last ice age, an ancient hookup between two different human species is still quietly influencing how your immune system reacts to modern diseases. That's not science fiction. That's just Tuesday for your DNA. Denisovans left their mark too, especially in populations across Asia and Oceania. We already mentioned the high-altitude gene in Tibetans, which traces back to Denisovan ancestry and helps people survive and thrive in oxygen-thin mountain environments where most humans would struggle. In parts of Papua New Guinea and other Melanesian populations, Denisovan DNA can make up around 4 to 6% of someone's genome, which is honestly an enormous amount when you think about it. That's not a faint genetic whisper from the past. That's a substantial piece of who they are, biologically today. So here's the reframe. We didn't just outcompete or replace these other human species. In many places, we absorbed them. Their genes didn't vanish from Earth. They got folded into us, diluted across generations, scattered through populations until the original species labels stopped making sense, but the biological legacy kept rolling forward. In a very strange and slightly poetic way, Neanderthals and Denisovans aren't fully extinct. They're just distributed, spread thin across billions of people who don't even know they're walking around as part-time Neanderthal. Now let's pump the brakes for a second, because there's a temptation here to make this story sound like a tidy little narrative. Modern humans showed up, outsmarted everyone, had some romantic encounters, and slowly absorbed all the competition into one big happy species. But real history is rarely that neat, and scientists are still actively arguing about the details, which honestly is part of what makes this topic so fun to dig into. For one thing, the timeline isn't uniform across the globe. Neanderthals disappeared from different regions at different times. Some pockets, particularly in southern Spain, may have held on later than populations elsewhere in Europe. Floresiensis on that island in Indonesia may have persisted in isolation far longer than originally thought, possibly overlapping with modern humans for tens of thousands of years before vanishing, and we still don't fully know why, since their isolated island lifestyle meant they weren't necessarily competing directly with large incoming sapiens populations the same way Neanderthals were. Some researchers point to volcanic activity in the region as a possible factor in their disappearance. Environmental catastrophe rather than human competition. And then there's Homo naledi, which throws an extra wrench into the whole tidy narrative, because dating evidence suggests naledi might have still been around in southern Africa as recently as around 250,000 years ago, meaning they could have overlapped with early Homo sapiens populations in Africa itself, long before sapiens even left the continent, which raises a genuinely fascinating, slightly unsettling question. Did early humans encounter naledi in Africa the same way later humans encountered Neanderthals in Europe? Was there an even earlier round of this same story playing out, one we have far less evidence for because it happened so much further back in time, with far fewer fossils surviving to tell the tale? This is the part of the story where I have to be honest with you. Paleoanthropology is one of those fields where the answers keep changing because the evidence keeps growing. 20 years ago, the idea that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals at all was controversial, dismissed by plenty of serious scientists. Then ancient DNA sequencing technology improved dramatically, and suddenly we could pull genetic information out of bones tens of thousands of years old. And the entire picture flipped. We went from these were separate species who definitely didn't mix to, wait, basically everyone outside Africa is carrying ancient hybrid DNA. That's an enormous reversal, and it happened within the careers of scientists still actively working today, which means the next major discovery, maybe from some cave system nobody's even excavated properly yet, could flip the picture again. So why does any of this actually matter? Why should you care about a handful of extinct human species and some ancient interbreeding drama from tens of thousands of years ago? Because it fundamentally changes how we should think about what it means to be human. For most of our existence as a genus, being human didn't mean being one single unified thing. It meant being part of a sprawling, branching family tree with multiple species figuring out survival in parallel, sometimes clashing, sometimes cooperating, sometimes, apparently, falling into bed together. The idea that there's only ever been one correct version of being human is actually a relatively new and temporary state of affairs, biologically speaking. We're the anomaly. The the lone survivor standing in a family photo where everyone else has mysteriously left the frame. And there's something almost humbling in that. We like to think of ourselves as the inevitable endpoint of evolution, the pinnacle, the species that was always destined to come out on top. But the truth is messier and far more contingent than that. If certain climate events had gone differently, if certain populations of Neanderthals had been slightly larger, slightly more genetically diverse, slightly luckier during a brutal winter 40,000 years ago, if a volcanic eruption near Flores hadn't wiped out whatever it wiped out, we could very plausibly be living in a world today where multiple human species still exist side by side, where you might pass a Neanderthal on the street, or work alongside a Denisovan colleague, or watch the news cover relations between different human nations that aren't even the same species. It sounds like science fiction, but for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, that wasn't fiction at all. That was just reality. Instead, through a combination of competition, climate catastrophe, sheer demographic advantage, and yes, a fair amount of cross-species romance, we ended up as the last ones standing. The final human species in a story that used to have a much bigger cast. So the next time someone asks why we're the only human species left, you can tell them it's not really one single answer. It's not just we killed them, though that probably happens sometimes. It's not just the climate got them, though that was definitely a massive factor. It's not just we outcompeted them, though our larger social networks and adaptability almost certainly gave us an edge. And it's not just we absorbed them through interbreeding, even though there's a piece of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA living quietly inside the cells of most people on this planet right now, possibly affecting their immune system as we speak. It's all of it. A tangled, messy, multi-causal extinction event spread across tens of thousands of years, and an entire planet, with different pressures hitting different species in different ways at different times. The kind of complicated, unsatisfying, it's complicated answer that real history almost always gives you instead of the clean narrative we wish we had. But maybe that's actually the more interesting takeaway here. We're not the result of some inevitable march of progress where the best species naturally rose to the top. We're the product of an enormous amount of luck, a fair amount of ruthlessness, and apparently a willingness to interbreed with whoever else happened to be standing in the same cave 40,000 years ago. Every single one of us carrying outside African ancestry is quite literally walking proof that the line between us and them was never as clean as we like to imagine. So somewhere out there, deep in your genome, there might be a tiny fragment of code that originally belonged to a Neanderthal hunting mammoths in Ice Age Europe, or a Denisovan surviving on a frozen Siberian plateau. They didn't completely vanish. They just became part of the recipe. And honestly, that might be the most human thing about us. That even our extinctions are a little bit complicated.